I want to quote you back to yourself. Yesterday you said current approach to policy making is phantasmagoria. What do you mean?
What do I mean? Well, if you look at the OBR's report, it points out that in the 12 years it's existed, there have been 6 fiscal frameworks that the government has set out. And the OBR then bases its forecasts around the fiscal framework and whether they will be achieved. But the OBR's forecasts are always wrong. So you've got wrong forecasts on a framework that will change. And I don't think that's a good way for policy making. I think what you need, to go back to the last item on cake recipes, is to bake a bigger cake. This was Margaret Thatcher's argument, that you need economic growth to make sure that there is more for everybody rather than dividing up what currently exists.
The Chancellor's calling this a budget for growth, and he believes that it's optimistic and that he is doing exactly that, but you're not convinced?
Well, he's starting from a very difficult point because so much money, £400 billion, was spent on COVID, and therefore the public finances are stretched, and you have to live within your means. I think we need to get spending under control. The problem is the state is spending too much money. It's doing too much for people's lives rather than letting people do things for themselves. And you won't get to a sensible lower tax rate with the ability to grow the economy on the back of that until we look at where we're spending money.
I suppose, with all due respect, Mr. Rees-Mogg, we could all say spending's too high, it should be cut, and then you get to the nitty-gritty, which is, what do you cut? Do you have anything in mind where you think, well, we could be doing without that?
Well, you're absolutely right. That is always the hard question. One of the things that Boris Johnson was trying to do was to reduce the civil service by 91,000. That's a pretty good start, because if you reduce the civil service, you reduce the machine that churns out the regulations, and you reduce, therefore, the ability to churn out costs onto businesses. So there are places that you can start, but ultimately you've got to look at the costs we have for welfare and the efficiency of the NHS. I don't think we can cut NHS spending, but we have been seeing increasingly, and Wes Streeting, a Labour shadow minister, has been pointing out that the NHS needs reform.
Should we be cutting other people's welfare before our own? In other words, I'm thinking about the foreign aid budget.
Oh, well, I've always been very sceptical of the foreign aid budget, that I was in favour of its reduction when that was brought through, and I think we should look at our foreign aid more as investment rather than in money that we give away, so that we should expect a long-term return from it, except, of course, for emergencies.
The Chancellor ploughed ahead with his rise in corporation tax, and he's introduced a number of measures to try and mitigate that. I know you described it as salami slicing the rise with capital allowances, and you don't think that that is a good approach. I put that point to John Glenn, Chief Secretary to the Treasury this morning. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Well, I'm very aware of Jacob's views. They'll never change, but the reality is that we still have the lowest corporation tax rate in the G7. And with this, what we call full expensing, where basically all investment in new capital and machinery can be set against tax, that will mean a 27 billion tax cut for businesses over the next 3 years. And the question that should be asked of those who think we should maintain the 19%, something that Jacob and others voted for 2 years ago, was what effect did that actually have on investment? And the truth is that it didn't give us the investment that we wanted. And so now we've linked those two together. We still have the most competitive corporation tax in the G7.
What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I'm not a great fan of the OBR, but if you look at what the OBR says about this investment allowance, it says all it will do is bring forward investment from future years. It won't actually increase the total stock of investment. But philosophically, I don't think this is the right approach. What governments should do is set the lowest tax rates they can and then allow businesses to make their decisions as to whether they invest or whether they pay dividends or whether they pay more to their staff, rather than saying that we want this tax avoidance scheme, because that's what allowances are. They're a means of perfectly legitimate tax avoidance, and one should always remember avoidance is legitimate, evasion is not. But that if you set simple low tax rates, businesses decide for themselves. And paying it out to their staff isn't necessarily a bad thing. The staff in a bonus may decide, if there's extra money, that they spend that on economic activity or they invest it. Likewise with dividends. If it goes to the shareholders, they may invest it in businesses that have greater chances of growth. And it's about allowing the free market to operate rather than thinking that the government knows best what business should do. It doesn't.
It's interesting talking about tax avoidance. I mean, I suppose you could argue then these pensions changes are a form of legal tax avoidance.
Of course they are.
Yeah, and look, you know, welcome, because the Chancellor this morning saying that that's going to save the NHS £3 billion a year that they spend on locums, for example, keeping highly skilled consultants in the sector. So good from that point of view. But then at the same time, you've got Savanta coming out doing a poll yesterday after the budget saying 67% of people think not enough is being done to help with the cost of living from this budget. Is this not sort of tax avoidance for the 1%, as The Guardian have it, and forgetting about the rest of us?
Well, I think sorting out the pension problem for the NHS has been really very important. That I've had my own constituents come to me saying they really want to carry on working in the NHS, but because of the pensions cap, they were getting very large tax bills on not huge earnings. It's just they'd built up this large pot over 30 or 40 years. So that needed to be done. And once you were doing it for the NHS, it wasn't just the NHS that was affected. But it is a mainly public sector issue with final salary schemes. On the cost of living, actually, dealing with the cost of living is primarily the Bank of England and monetary policy, and is regrettably increasing interest rates. I think the Bank of England was asleep at the wheel during Mark Carney's period of office, and that interest rates should have risen gradually from about 2014. The failure to do that has led to both inflation and very sharp increases. Unfortunately, the Bank of England bungled monetary policy and missed its target, and is now having to catch up. The only way that's the government's fault is that the government has agreed to carry on with Bank of England independence, but I think most people feel that is the right risk to be taking.
Just want to finish by asking you about your own show on a Monday night. You're a few weeks into it now. How do you find that, hearing from the general public as to what they think about what you are saying? Does that embolden you?
Oh, yes, and it's every night. It's Monday to Thursday.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock.
I've only been watching on Monday night. How do you find time for every night?
You're missing out. Well, my dinner party plans are slightly interrupted, but I'm not an Islingtonian dinner party man, so that's fine. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. What your viewers and my viewers think is where the mainstream of the British electorate are, and we need to keep in contact with that, and politicians reflect it rather than getting into the Islingtonian dinner party set.